And the way that you deal with refugees of any war, it's the way that all other refugees were dealt with after World War II, is you resettle them. There's the 3 R's of refugee protocol, how you deal with them: resettlement, reintegration, repatriation.
I don't think it's a just war for 2 reasons. I agree with what Brianna said very much about the specific conditions under which this war has been fought.
Jews are indigenous to Judea. Arabs are indigenous to Arabia, to the Arabian Peninsula.
The Arabs did not attack Israel in 1967. Israel started that. Israel started the 1967 war.
It did?
That's a false statement.
Okay.
No civilians have died at a faster rate since the 1980s. Why does he say the 1980s?
Why?
Because he knows that because if he didn't, you'd have to go back to World War II, which everybody knows was a just war.
What is Israel fighting for? October 7th was a tragedy. It was a massacre. It should have never happened. It should never happen again. But this conflict didn't start on October 7th. And what Israel is fighting for is to have a Jewish state in Palestine, an ethnically Jewish state.
The efforts that Israel is making to try to minimize Palestinian casualties.
Civilian
casualties. I mean, they really put their own soldiers in danger.
The Jews in Israel want its own separate, we need to be over here and you guys need to be over here, is sort of what is that what he's saying?
He shouldn't have cut her off.
He was straw-manning her argument, saying, oh, your solution is to build them an airport.
Yeah, right.
But her answer
is the right of return.
Okay, so explain this.
Right. So what the right of return, according to Brianna and Jake, which they both agree is the answer,
after October 7th happens, Israel should have just let Palestinians...
What they say is a refugee population of 6 million Palestinians return, quote unquote, to Israel proper.
In this episode of the Politics Pagoda, I sit down with Karys Rhea from the Epoch Times. Karys has written extensively on the topic of Palestine and Israel. Today we discuss the war in Gaza and America's involvement. We also break down video of a debate that we both attended in person in New York City between Michael Moynihan, Eli Lake, Brianna Joy Gray, and Jake Klein. Again, thanks for tuning in to this episode, and I hope you enjoy. Karys Rhea, welcome to the Politics Pagoda.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
Absolutely. So, you're here because there was an event a few weeks back. First, actually, you're from the Epoch Times, correct? You're a producer from the Epoch Times. You've written extensively on this particular topic, which is the Hamas-Israel conflict, which is a very, very heated topic to talk about. But we're going to try to do a high-wire act and navigate ourselves through this as best we can.
Great.
So you and I went to an event a few weeks back called Dissident Dialogues. And the first night that event ended with the motion, is Israel's war on Hamas just or not? And there were 4 people up there. Eli Lake and Michael Moynihan were arguing that it was a just war. And then Brianna Gray and Jake Klein were arguing that it was not a just war. Right?
Right. Brianna was arguing that it wasn't a war at all. So she rejected the premise to begin with. But yeah.
Right.
Generally speaking.
Okay. And we'll get into that.
Yeah.
We will. But so what I wanted to do with you was, they only went for an hour.
Right.
And it was a very charged, very emotional sort of back and forth between the 4 of them. Konstantin Kisin was the moderator. He did his best to try to moderate this very complicated issue. So what I wanted to do with you is go back and play the film back and go through some of the more complicated issues and see if we can sort of flesh these things out. So why don't we go back first, before we play our first clip? Why don't you just give a synopsis of that night and sort of what you observed and what happened?
Sure. Well, what I observed was that there were two assumptions that the anti-Israel side were resting on that were not really acknowledged. Jake and Brianna are resting on the idea that Jews are not indigenous to this land. Once you accept that, it's a whole different conversation.
It's a different analysis because the assumption is you took this land away from Palestinians.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Unjustly.
Right. If you accept that Jews are indigenous to Judea or modern day Israel, then the whole idea of this settler colonialist state, right? These evil usurpers, crusaders that came in and stole the land
Mm-hmm.
is put into question, right? So it's really important to understand that that is an undercurrent on the anti-Israel side. And that one idea can be heavily disputed. To me, it can be disputed very simply and very quickly.
How so?
Well, Jews are indigenous to Judea. Arabs are indigenous to Arabia, to the Arabian Peninsula. In the 7th century, the Arab conquest, they spread out to the Middle East. They conquered and Islamized huge swaths of land all the way up to Spain.
So the Jews were conquered by
Exactly.
the Arabs.
Of course. And not just the Arabs, as you know, they were conquered by the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Crusaders and the Romans and the Ottomans.
You can keep going as far back as you want.
Right. But it's, and the word Palestine, you might say, well, what about Palestinians? Aren't they indigenous to Palestine, right? Mm-hmm. But the word Palestine is a term that was a colonial term that was imposed by the Romans. That word did not exist. The Romans came into Judea, they ethnically cleansed the Jews, and they changed the name of that region to Syria Palestina in honor of the Jewish biblical enemy, the Philistines, who are, I believe, descendants of the Greeks or something. Okay, so that name in itself is a colonialist invention, and it never referred to any sort of national identity. It just referred to people who lived in that region. So Palestinians were Jews and Arabs. That's why the Palestine Post was a Jewish newspaper. It was a precursor to the Jerusalem Post. I mean, when you see, ancient coins and they say Palestinian, it's written in Hebrew, because Palestinian, there was no differentiation. I mean, Jews on their ID cards, it said Palestinian. Okay. So again, it was not a national identity or any sort of marker of indigeneity either. It was a name that came much later. And even the West Bank, like that area is called Judea and Sumeria. And then Jordan came in 1948 through 1967, ethnically cleansed the Jews, and changed the name to the West Bank, meaning west of the Jordan River, to make it anyway. This is getting into like a whole bunch of history.
So there's plenty of history on this,
yeah.
And you've written about this extensively. You've spoken about this extensively. Where can people find your work where you've written this?
If you Google my name, Karys Rhea, all my articles will come up. They're also on my LinkedIn. I think Muckrack, keeps track of them. But so that's one assumption, that Jews are not indigenous to this land, that Jake's and Brianna's entire arguments are resting on. The other thing I think that was interesting to observe was that they view Hamas and this greater conflict against Israel in a vacuum, as if Hamas is somehow distinct from other Islamist terrorist groups, as if Hamas is so different from Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or Al-Shabaab or ISIS or Jamaat-e-Islami, all the the hundreds and hundreds of Islamic terrorist groups, whether they're Deobandi or Salafi, wherever they come from, they all have the same goals. And if you're not willing to accept that, then you will really believe that Hamas is just acting out of pure grievance against Israelis for taking their land. But if you understand that there's a greater goal at play here, that Hamas's goal, which they're very outspoken about, is not very different from other goals of Islamic terrorist groups.
And what is it?
It's an Islamic caliphate, and it's an Islamic caliphate over the region, and the complete expulsion or subjugation of any non-Muslim presence in that land to Islamic law or Sharia law. This is why Hamas is called Islamic resistance. This is why, like, the name, it means Islamic resistance. It's not, Hamas doesn't mean free Hamas.
Hamas.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different name in Arabic, and it means Islamic resistance. It doesn't mean free Palestine.
Right. Okay, so we're gonna watch the first clip, and I want you to break it down. What was going on and what Brianna was trying to say here, and maybe sort of clarify for anyone who doesn't really understand what she's talking about.
Sure.
Okay.
Let's do it.
I don't really feel like I have an opening statement. In some ways, I feel as though the reality of what's been happening on the ground for the last 7 months speaks for itself. People who started out at the beginning of this conflict feeling very strongly that Israel merited a response to an attack, which, as we all know, was the deadliest since the Holocaust, have now, after seeing 7 months in which 34,000 conservatively people have been killed, 3/4 of whom are women and children, feel like enough is enough.
Okay. So what is she trying to say there? She was given an opening statement, and she came out hot.
She said a conservative estimate is that 34,000 Palestinians have died.
Since when?
Since the beginning of the war. Which
pretty much started October 7th, as everyone.
I think it started, I think, a couple weeks later when Israel started with its airstrikes.
Right. So for context, it was October 7th happened. Hamas came in and murdered. We can say that word. Butchered Jewish citizens.
And anyone else, including Arab or Thai workers or anyone else they could find. Yeah.
And then took hostages. And that's what set off these last 7-8 months now.
Yeah. If that's not an act of war, I'm not really sure what is. I'm not really sure what country would tolerate a land, air, and sea invasion of, and massacre of 1,200 of their people.
And to be fair, just to put it into context, Americans don't have this issue. We can't even conceptualize it, because it would be like Mexico coming over the border from Tijuana and going into California and murdering 1,200 people and then taking a bunch of hostages back to Mexico, or right? It'd be something like, or Canada. It'd be Canadians coming over the border from New York and doing the same thing. We cannot conceptualize it.
Sure. So let's break down this number, 34,000. Okay.
That was a question that Constantine had. It's like, all right, this is the opening statement, but they get into the numbers.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. And it's such an important point to harp on, because this number forms the basis, presumably in Brianna and Jake's mind, or anyone else's mind, for charging Israel with the crime of genocide, right? If there was like 10 Palestinians that had died, I don't think anybody would be screaming genocide, right? So it's very important that this number is accurate, because it forms the basis for so much policy to come afterwards. So there are incredible biomathematicians, statisticians, data scientists, Abraham Weimer, Laurie Stone, Gabe Epstein, I think is his name. There's like 4 or 5 people who have really, really broken down these numbers. And I would really encourage people to check out their work.
Are they boots on the ground?
No, they're people that look at publicly, anybody can do this. They look at publicly available information, Hamas ministry's own reports, the UN's report, Hamas's government media office reports, which also kind of echoes what the Ministry of Health is saying. And here's the thing. They look at methodology and the timeline.
Who's they?
These statisticians,
individuals that you just
right
mentioned.
And they look at the methodology, okay, which neither Bree nor Jake has actually looked into.
You'd know this for a fact.
Well, presumably, because the entire argument that there were 34,000 people killed just disintegrates. But you don't even need to do that to know that these numbers are fraudulent. All you have to do is look at the publicly available data and use common sense. So before we get into the methodology, which is a little bit tricky because it's statistics and stuff, it took me a while to understand it. Let's just talk about some basic things for that with that number, okay? If you look at the chart of the Hamas ministry, like let's say the first month of the war, right? Hamas was publishing daily reports of the total number of casualties and then broken down by women and children. If you look at their graphs, just take like the first month, they increase with methodical linearity. Absolutely impossible consistency. The chart is like this. You would have to find in any situation in war, there is variability by day because operations change. You're not routinely killing the same amount of people. You're bombing a tunnel one day, you're going in and trying to find a hostage another day. One morning you're taking out a weapons depot. This is war, right? So you would, and any other chart, when you look at war casualties in any other war, there's statistical variability in the total number, right? One day you have this many, then you have this many, then you have this many, then you have, right? But the graphs, it'll be like, all right, the total number is 10,037 people killed one day. And then the next day it's 13,037. Oh, okay, so exactly 3,000 people were killed, right?
You said 13,000.
11, 12, yeah, 3, right. So exactly 3,000 more people were killed, exactly, right? Like these are just statistical impossibilities. Do you understand what I'm saying? They're too consistent. The total numbers are too consistent. Now, the other side of it is, so while you need statistical variability for the total numbers, the numbers of women and children generally stay the same, generally, depending on like what area you're in. But they have much less statistical variability, right? And yet, in the reports, these change wildly. So one day, you'll look at a report and it's like 99% women and children. How is that possible?
So in these
Israel
numbers,
would have to go out of its way to not be killing men.
Right. So these numbers are taken from the Hamas
Ministry of
Health.
They're also taken from the Hamas media office, which is really interesting. And they generally share reports, but they were the primary source that like the UN, the international community was using. But if you look at their reports, they have the dead resurrected, like different days, like 300 men come back to life. And the UN stopped using their reports in January and started focusing on the ministry. The ministry in March, by the way, the Hamas Ministry of Health dropped the 70% women and children claim in March quietly. They could not, because they could not justify it because their own data debunks it.
Okay, so I want to get back on track here and not get too bogged down in...
Well, I think, but I think it's important that we just really quickly talk about the methodology, because somebody might say, well, there's two things. Somebody might say, well, that's not true. There was never a report that said 99% of women and children.
So by the methodology, you're talking about the method by which these statistics have been compiled.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody like Pierce Morgan, right, will argue, you hear this argument a lot. You say, well, yeah, it's Hamas, but if you look at other conflicts with Hamas and Israel, the numbers that the Hamas Health Ministry has put out have actually been verified to be mostly correct. So just looking at precedent, we should trust these numbers. But what Pierce Morgan is not understanding is that other conflicts were completely different. In other conflicts, like the 2009 war, 2012, 2014, 2020 war, all these conflicts were very short, like a number of weeks, and the United Nations and NGOs could verify these numbers pretty much in real time. And all of these numbers were registered with bodies. And the methodology that was used was only one of 3 types of methods that Hamas has used in this war. So the methodology used in other conflicts, and Hamas still tried to inflate those numbers, but in those other wars, but the UN and the NGOs were there to very quickly, correct them and come up with real numbers. So the methodology that was used in those wars was the hospital and morgue system, in which you need a body and the information, the identification is registered. Right? That was the only method. But today, Hamas uses 3 methods. They use that one method, and then they use what's called media. I think it's a trustworthy media sources or verifiable media sources, or something like that, right? Which have no registration, no body.
That's the second method. And then what's the third one?
The third is Google reports that like families of somebody who was dead can submit. So the second 2 have no verification. They have no bodies. They have no registration. Okay. And there could be overlap, right? Because somebody could report that my husband just died, right, in an Israeli airstrike. But that body could already be registered in the morgue system. There's no way of knowing. So there could be tremendous double counting.
So the two other methods may not be as reliable as the first.
Well, of course, and there's no way to verify them.
Okay.
And this is why the UN split its number of women and children in half, 50%, just a couple months ago.
Okay.
So that would be what, 40% women and children. Now that might still sound like a lot to people, but not if you think about the fact that 75% of the population of Gaza is women and children.
70% of the population. 75%.
Mm-hmm.
So how many people live in Gaza? What's the population?
2 million, like 2.2, 2.3, yeah.
Okay. And since then, 34,000 people, that's the number that they're talking about?
Hamas is saying.
That Hamas is saying.
And Israel says that about half of that is combatants. And here's another really funny thing about the Hamas Health Ministry. There's no combatants. Right? So they have their charts. They say this percentage is women, this percentage is children. Well, what percentage is terrorists? What percentage is fighters?
Mm-hmm.
They don't tell you. There's not one Hamas fighter who has died according to the Hamas Health Ministry. Not only that, there's no accounting for like errant rockets. We know by Hamas's own admission that somewhere between like 10 and 15% of all rockets that they fire are errant. They're misfired and they land in civilian populations. And for example, like one time, a document was recovered where Hamas admitted there was 7 casualties that they killed errantly, and they listed the names, and those casualties showed up, in UN reports in the ministry as an Israeli raid that still has never been corrected.
Yeah, and here's the reason why I get the numbers portion of this, that we want to try to get as accurate of a picture as possible, but I don't know if we can, because the information that's coming out, it's chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
It's a war right now, and to get an accurate picture of the numbers is, most people are going to fall short of that.
Right, and also along that point, it took Israel months before they could actually verify the number of people that were murdered on October 7th. Right. And the numbers changed. But when they could get an actual clear, 1,200 total death conclusion. And yet Hamas will put out reports like there was that, notorious bombing of the Al Ali parking lot, which people said was a hospital. And like within minutes, within an hour, Hamas had a complete death count of 500 people. It was insane. I mean, that just this stuff, it takes a long time to find this information. Now we know that there was actually only about 40 people that died. And Hamas said that 30,000 people had been injured in that strike on the hospital. But the amount of hospital beds in all of the medical facilities in Gaza, including UN facilities, can only hold 3,000. So where are those 30,000?
Yep.
And we know that 90 people who were hurt actually were sent to Egypt for treatment. We know that. Egypt confirmed it. But if Hamas is saying 30,000, why didn't more of them go? It's just...
So the number is probably somewhere between 15 and 30. We just don't really know.
I don't know.
Yep.
Because I don't want to sit here and be like, let's trust Israeli sources too.
Right.
Do I trust Israeli sources? Yeah, because I've seen how they conduct themselves in the past when there are errors, and I see how they the types of mistakes they make and the type of accountability. But I don't think for our purposes that's a productive thing for me to say. Just trust Israel,
And I think whether the number is 15 or closer to 34, 35,000, the deaths we can all agree are a bad thing, especially if it is women and children. It is sad.
Mm-hmm.
I think what Michael Moynihan in at this debate stated and made a good point about this. He was in Ukraine, covering the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and he said, he was in bars in Ukraine, and they were coming up with these numbers, and he realized that, of course, the Ukrainians are going to pump that number up, and it's hard to trust that because, and he said, look, I was on the side of the Ukrainian people, but at the same time, it's like, how can we trust those types of numbers when they're coming from? I think the point is that you have to sort of be skeptical of sourcing.
Of course. But I think it's interesting to note here that while Hamas is putting out daily reports of deaths, Israel doesn't do that. So the only reason why Israel has even said anything like, oh, there have been, 15,000, well, they actually haven't given a number. I think they've said half of the people that we have killed have been combatants. And they are very, very loath to give an actual number because they are professionals, right, and they recognize that this is war. There is a reason why the United Nations stopped trying to come up with death counts in the Syrian war between 2014 and 2021. Yep. They didn't even bother to try and the Ethiopian civil war because there's no way to verify it.
It's very difficult.
So Israel is actually being more honest in a sense by not saying how many people it is killing, women, children, or Hamas figures. What they will say is half of everybody who has died has been a combatant, and they won't say what the number is.
I want to play this clip.
Okay.
And move on to
sure.
Move off. We're going to come back to the numbers because they do talk about it again, but just wanted to play this clip for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think it's a just war. I don't think it's a just war for two reasons. I agree with what Brianna said very much about the specific conditions under which this war has been fought. The massive amount of civilians' lives lost. 70% of the casualties have been women and children. That means a minimum of about 25,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza. No government in any war since the 1980s has killed civilians at as fast a rate, with the exception of full-blown genocides like Rwanda or the Second Congo War, which is the bloodiest war since World War II. And this isn't some accident. This isn't because
we can talk about that.
Okay,
Hamas.
What do you contend with what Jake's saying?
Well, let's just think about it this way. Before this war, Israel has killed fewer Palestinians in the entire conflict starting in 1948 than the number of civilians that died in the American-led operation on ISIS alone.
So where are you getting that from?
Basic facts. You can literally Google how many people died totally in the entire conflict from 1948 till now.
So what you're saying is that the Israelis have killed less people from 1948 to...
Yeah, there's been about 20 to 30,000, I think, Palestinians that have died totally.
From that time.
If I remember
correctly.
And then now, yeah. And this is very, very publicly available knowledge. Like this is not something that, like this is something you can Wikipedia. Like Wikipedia ISIS campaign casualties.
So what you're saying, ISIS campaign, the Americans, say that stat again. What's the comparison?
So I'm just saying he's saying that Israel has. Do you want to play it again really quickly?
Sure.
Yeah, I don't think it's a just war. I don't think it's a just war for two reasons. I agree with what Brianna said very much about the specific conditions under which this war has been fought. The massive amount of civilians' lives lost. 70% of the casualties have been women and children. That means a minimum of about 25,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza. No government in any war since the 1980s has killed civilians at as fast a rate, with the exception of full-blown genocides.
Okay, yeah. So the 1980s. So I wasn't specifically addressing his question. The point that I was making was how few Palestinians have died prior to this war relative to other wars and other campaigns and other conflicts, even comparatively to other like terrorist organizations. But if we want to address the specific thing he said no civilians have died at a faster rate since the 1980s. Why does he say the 1980s?
Why?
Because he knows that because if he didn't, you'd have to go back to World War II, which everybody knows was a just war, the Allies fighting against the Axis, right? And yet how many Germans died? Right? How many? I mean, what the Battle of Manila? Like 100,000 civilians died in that was Japanese, and you know what the bombing of Dresden, you know the atomic bomb. I mean, by their logic, we genocided the Germans in World War II because of how many Germans that we killed. And yet nobody would make that argument because everybody understands that the Allies were on the side of right and the Germans were on the side of wrong. In other words,
let me just break down what you're saying. I think I get what you're saying.
Casualty count is not a measure of morality in any war. That's just not how you measure morality, because if you were to do that, then World War II, you'd come out with the Allies looking like the bad guys because we killed so many Germans.
He's going back to the 80s because if he goes back the next round, it would need to be World War II. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah. I mean, if he goes back, yeah. I mean, why'd they start at the 80s? Probably because we know World War II, but maybe there were also wars in the 60s or the 70s that we could all agree were, you know, just wars where a lot more civilians died at a faster rate, right? But let's talk about this too. At a faster rate, what he's saying. Like, let's unpack that.
What is he trying to?
Well, he's saying that more civilians have been killed in a short amount of time than in any other conflict since the 80s.
Since the 80s, okay.
Okay, in a short amount of time. So would he prefer? And he's saying that as a pejorative, right? This is something he's condemning Israel for doing.
Okay.
So would he prefer the opposite? Would he prefer that Israel kill the same amount of Palestinians that they've killed, but stretched out over like a year or two? It makes no sense. Mm-hmm. What does a faster rate have to do with anything? Don't you think it's actually better if you have a quick war that's over with? Mm-hmm. So you don't have more, you know, death is not the only measure of suffering, right? There's also people that, you know, have lost their homes and are displaced and don't have food and, right? I mean, so wouldn't you rather a short, quick war where, you know, there's collateral damage and you defeat the enemy and then you can start rebuilding than a long so I don't understand what this faster rate has to do with anything.
I get what you're saying. And we have to make a distinction between death and casualty. A casualty in war, you could take somebody out with a bomb and it kills 3 people, but there were 14 casualties.
Right.
Casualty could be, broken leg, you're out. You don't get to come back right now
Yeah.
until you could be injured or maimed is what I'm trying to say, is what a casualty could be. Let's finish what he says, and then we'll continue sort of analyzing what his argument is.
Rwanda or the Second Congo War, which is the bloodiest war since World War II. And this isn't some accident. This isn't because Hamas is just hiding and using these people as human shields. It's because Israel has policies that allows them to kill up to 20 civilians if it leads to the death of a single suspected junior militant, and hundreds of civilians to kill a single senior Hamas commander. So I don't think that's just. There's also
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. I want to start with the first thing he says. He immediately dismisses human shields as the reason why so many Palestinians are dying, right?
Okay, so let me see if I can sort of first phrase the question for you, because I've heard this. I've heard that, and I'm no expert in this. This is just me reading up on sort of what Hamas has been doing in this area. Is they are building tunnels. Again, I just have heard reporting of that. They built tunnels
Hundreds of miles of tunnels.
And underneath the land, and then they have bases, military bases underneath schools and hospitals, and that they're using civilians such as doctors and healthcare providers and teachers and students at schools as human shields. Now, he's saying that that's not completely accurate.
No. He didn't say that. He said the reason why, he's not denying that they use human shields. Maybe he would deny it, but that's not the point he's making here. The point he's making here is the reason why so many civilians are dying, and at such a quick rate or something, is not because of the human shields.
Right. Okay. Yep.
First of all, I have no idea how he knows that. Like, how can he say it's not because of that? But also, human shields, using human shields in urban warfare is the single most definitive marker for determining the amount of people who are dying. Okay, there's a military in military doctrine, in the doctrine of war, there's something called there's laws of war, right? There's something called distinction. This is why armies use uniforms, because they need to, even though it makes them a target to the enemy,
they need to distinguish between whether or not you're a civilian or whether or not you're a soldier.
And even and not just armies do it. I mean, even a lot of guerrilla armies do it, right? Because they still don't want their own people, their own civilians to die, right? Look at the Nazis. The Nazis wore uniforms, right? They're the model of the quintessential evil fighting force in the world, right? They didn't like Jews, they didn't like Poles, they didn't like gypsies, they didn't like gays, but they did want to save their own people. Not so with Hamas, and not so with other terrorist organizations, not so with Al-Qaeda, not so with ISIS. These groups, they can't defeat Israel or America militarily. So they have to come up with some other winning strategy.
Right.
And so the way that they can gain an upper hand is to maximize the casualties on their own side. That's a win-win situation for them. Remember, these people are deeply, deeply fanatical. They're deeply religious, and martyrdom is a critical component of their ideology, right?
So by that logic, the Hamas soldiers, if they're like, okay, if this group around me, if we're strategizing with war here, and these group of people, these citizens, if they die with me, then
that's a beautiful thing. Okay. We start the afterlife now, right? I mean, there are, if you look at the protests going on in London right now, I mean, they say this all the time in Europe and in Arabic, but in English, you hear a lot of these people that are protesting in London, and they chant like, "We love death, we love death," right? And these are religious fundamental Islamists, fundamentalists, right? Religious fundamentalists. They value death. So they don't look their idea. It's not like, I mean, you could say that's evil, but in their heads, it's not, because they're not even saying we don't care about these people. They're saying that for them to die, that's they're martyrs. They're martyrs for the cause. And that means they will be rewarded in the afterlife.
Got it.
Okay?
Yep. So I get what he's trying to say here. I understand what you're saying.
So saying that human shield. So going back to his point, saying that human shields is not the reason why there are so many casualties. I mean, that's absolutely insane. We're dealing with urban terrain here. Of course, that's the reason why there's so many casualties. If it wasn't, I mean, look at what Israel does to prevent casualties, and still there's casualties. They go to lengths that no other army has gone to in the history.
You're talking about the IDF.
The IDF, yeah. Sorry, did I say Hamas?
No, they.
They, yeah.
I just wanted to distinguish.
The IDF goes to lengths that no other army. I mean, read John Spencer, Andrew Fox, Richard Kemp. These are decorated war heroes around the world, and they went there on the ground to see how Israel fights its wars, and they cannot believe the efforts that Israel is making to try to minimize Palestinian casualties.
Civilian
casualties. I mean, they really put their own soldiers in danger to do ground, operations in, again, urban settings with booby traps, right? Where, like you said, Hamas is using schools and hospitals and people's apartment buildings to store weapons and launch rockets, right? And conduct their operations. And Israel could do more targeted airstrikes. And instead, they send their soldiers in, many of whom have died, so that they are able to possibly save the hostages and protect Palestinians on the other side. They notify sometimes weeks in advance of an operation, like in northern Gaza, when they're going to strike. I mean, look at what's been going in Rafah, right? They just went into Rafah. They spent weeks evacuating Rafah. Who does that?
Before they went in there.
85% of northern Gaza, or was it Gaza? I don't remember. 85% of the north was evacuated before Israel went in. Now, in any war, they estimate that 10% of civilians stay. In any war where people flee, there's always going to be 10% that stay, roughly. But but Israel drops millions and millions of leaflets. They send tens of thousands of millions of text messages, make tens of thousands of phone calls, personal phone calls. They drop these these speakers attached to parachutes that broadcast as soon as they hit the ground. It's unbelievable how far Israel goes. And to Jake and Bree's credit, in a sense, you can fault Israel for this because it is prolonging the war.
Yeah.
I mean, Israel could take out Hamas a lot faster, but there would be a much higher casualty rate.
Right.
But they are extending the war. There have been so many strikes that Israel has not carried out because there have been civilians in the way.
Let's finish up Jake's point here, and we'll get your thoughts on what he has to say here.
I mean, in the debate, we'll go through a bunch of things. But the other part of it we have to think about is what is Israel fighting for? October 7th was a tragedy. It was a massacre. It should have never happened. It should never happen again. But this conflict didn't start on October 7th. And what Israel is fighting for is to have a Jewish state in Palestine, an ethnically Jewish state. That is identity politics. I think anybody here that had a problem with identity politics on any topic over the woke wars over the last couple of years, you shouldn't be supporting the United States sending $300 billion to one of the most clear-cut examples of identity politics.
Okay. So there's like 4 things he said there that I can tackle, and I want to know what you want me to tackle. There's the claim, one, that Israel has a policy that allows up to 20 civilians to be killed for every commander. He makes that claim. Then he makes the claim, as an aside, that there's also starvation. Okay, that's another claim. Then he...
Israel is specifically starving Palestinians. Okay.
Then he makes the claim that Israel is trying to create a Jewish state with it, which is identity politics, which is a form of identity politics. Then he makes the claim that we should not be sending 300 million, the U.S. should not be sending 300 million, a year to Israel. So I can unpack all of those. You pick.
Let's do the third one first, and then the last one.
What was the third one?
The third one was the woke
identity
politics where, okay, so if I can take his side of it, right?
Please.
So I think what he's trying to say is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that if you aren't in favor of woke identity politics, where you have tribal politics, where in America, I think the argument is black people are here, Asian people are here, Hispanic people are here, white people are here, and we should all be separated, right? We should. So I think what he's saying is that the Jews in Israel want its own separate, like, we need to be over here and you guys need to be over here. Is sort of what is that what he's saying?
Maybe he is saying that. I mean, I wonder how he would respond to the 20% of Israeli Arabs that live very comfortably in Israel proper, and all of the Christians.
So they're not Jewish. They're Israeli Arabs.
They're full citizens.
Christian Israelis as well.
Absolutely. Christian Israelis are some of the most successful groups in all of Israel.
So you're saying there is a melting pot there?
Oh, massively. Yeah. It's just like any other country in the whole world, right? Like, you have minorities, you have the majority.
But then you have majorities.
And there's conflicts, between them. There's problems, socioeconomic problems, there's problems with racism, but there's a lot of forces working to correct those, both in government and in NGOs and spaces, different spaces and stuff like that. It's like no different. Yeah, I think he's appealing because he knew we're at dissident dialogues, right? And ostensibly people are very anti-woke there. And I think he was trying to appeal to the audience that we have there. But identity politics is very different from identity, period. I don't see what's wrong with having a Jewish identity. I mean, does Jake think it's a problem that India is Hindu? Does he think it's a problem that Pakistan is Muslim? I mean, we have 56 Muslim countries in the world and one Jewish state the size of New Jersey. God knows how many Christian countries there are, Christian majority countries, right? So you keep hearing this phrase, especially with Brianna, Jewish ethno-state.
Okay, explain this. What does this mean?
Well, it's exactly what you just said. It's basically a state that favors Jews and is trying to keep Jews the dominant power at the expense of everybody else, who they try to keep separate or subjugated. Okay, so I would ask, because they use these words like it's like almost like it's one word, like fused together, like Jewish ethnicity. And I would ask Jake and Brianna, like, what would a Jewish state look like to them?
Mm-hmm.
We know what they're saying a Jewish ethno-state is.
But
what would a Jewish state look like to them, right? And what you would see is that it's not possible to have a Jewish state
where only Jews live. Is this what we're talking? What they're talking?
No. Well, they would say, right? Well, because we'll see later on in the debate, that they don't believe that there should be such a thing as a Jewish state. It offends their sensibilities. They want a one-state solution where everybody's living together, and it wouldn't be a Jewish state, right? So basically, what that means is that they don't think that there's any separation between a Jewish state and a Jewish ethno-state. A Jewish state is inherently an ethno-state to them. But I don't know why a Muslim state isn't an ethno-state to them, or a Christian state. I don't know what's different about Israel to them than anywhere else.
And what you're saying is that, look, in Israel. There are different regions and parts of Israel, but a majority of Israel, the majority of the population is Jewish.
For sure. Just like the majority of the population is Christian in America.
Right. So what Jake and Brianna are saying is that even though the Jews are a majority, they would need to sort of adhere to the issues of the minorities in Israel.
Well, no, what they think is that there should be a certain number of Palestinians that live in the diaspora that are allowed to return. And because that number is so large, they claim 6 million refugees, which is false, and we can get into that. But because that number is so large, that would essentially that would change the demographics, and then Jews would no longer be the majority. And that's fine to them. Okay. That's fine to them because that would be equal. It would be okay because everybody who should be living there would be living there, and you would just let the natural majority, instead of keeping Palestinians out, the natural majority then would be, the Palestinians, but the Jews Muslims. Could still, the Muslims, but the Jews could still live there and everybody could get along. That's what they want to happen.
But you're saying that...
Well, I mean, that would never happen. I mean, look at history. We can get in. I mean, this is a whole... Look at how Jews have been treated in every single Arab Muslim country.
So is what you're saying is that if that were to happen, where you go pre-1947, that region, that the Palestinian Muslims would just effectively take out the Jewish population?
Well, let's consult history. And before 1947...
Is that kind of what you think would happen?
Well, of course. There's no Jews in the West Bank, in Area A and B, the areas that the Palestinian Authority controls. When Jordan was in control, when occupied the West Bank from 1948 1967, they kicked out all their Jews.
So you're saying history
Close to 1 million Jews in Arab lands were
Right.
ethnically cleansed in the 40s.
Right.
Jews lived... since the Arab conquest, the Arab Muslim conquest, they've lived as second-class citizens, what's called dhimmis. They had to pay a special tax. They were barred, just like in Europe. Jews were barred from having certain jobs. They had to walk in the gutter when an Arab passed them. Even in pre-1947 Palestine, when it was under the British Mandate, or before, during the Ottoman Empire, Jews their holy sites were desecrated. There was random massacres, 1920, 1921, 1929, 1936, 1939. Before that was during the Mandate. Before that, the Ottoman Empire. I mean, they treated the Jews better than the other Arabs, the Turks did, but Jews were still heavily discriminated against.
We'll come back to the $300 billion being sent,
Sure.
of American taxpayer dollars over. We'll come back to this. Let's try to finish this up.
In the Middle East. This is not good for U.S. security. This harms us. And that money makes it easier for Israel to avoid making peace with its neighbors. So I don't think the ultimate cause of the Zionist project is just. For the exact same reason I opposed all the wokeness of the last couple of years, I oppose the goal of having a Jewish ethno-state, but then also the conduct in the war has not been just. Although October 7th was a tragedy, Hamas should not be in power, and I have no problem with terrorists and murderers being taken out, but there are also terrorists and murderers amongst the Israeli government.
Okay, so he says that money shouldn't be sent to help Israel with the war. I'm not a big fan of U.S. taxpayer dollars being sent over to, let's say, Ukraine and Russia, and then Israel and Hamas. And there are a lot of Americans that don't like these open-ended wars that we're getting involved in and sending money out. So tell me why that this is a good thing that we're sending this much money over there.
Sure. Well, first of all, I don't think it's a good thing. I agree with you. There's actually a whole swath of Zionists like myself who are very adamantly opposed to the relationship of America sending millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars of aid to Israel. And we believe that over time, not right now because we're in the middle of a war, but over time, Israel needs to wean itself off of American aid, and there needs to be a decoupling in that sense. However, that conversation needs to be had in good faith, where you actually understand what this aid means and the terms of the agreement. And Jake and Bree clearly do not understand the terms of the agreement.
What don't
the
they
terms
understand?
are this $300 million,
$300 billion.
$300 billion. Excuse me. Thank you. 300 billion. I think it's actually more than that. I think it's like 3.8 billion that America sends like Israel every year.
Every year?
Yeah.
3.8 billion or
I think so.
300?
No, I think it's 3.8 billion. You could look it up. You should see.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't have the numbers, but
yeah, there's like a huge package that gets sent to Israel every year historically in
Okay.
war or not.
Okay.
And this is not aid in a technical sense. It's not like America gets nothing back for it. First of all, I think it's 100% now. It might be 75, but at least 70% of this money has to be spent in the US, which means that this money employs tens of thousands of Americans, especially in a place like Boston, for example, with jobs. So does Jake want to be the one that goes and tells those people, sorry, you're out of a job because right? So that actually helps people.
So you're saying that
I'm saying that there's very specific conditions. It's not like we're giving them $3.8 billion and we don't get anything in return. We also get incredible intelligence sharing and all this kind of stuff. Also, here's something to keep in mind. 3.8 billion is a lot of money. I agree. Okay. But do we have any troops there?
Right. No, I mean,
None.
Right.
We don't fight Israel's wars for them. Israel fights its own battles. Look at the presence of our troops in the world. How much manpower and resources that we spend in Europe. We still haven't left Germany since World War II, right? Korea. I mean, other places in the Middle East, right? And yet we don't have any boots on the ground in Israel. So maybe this 3.8 billion seems like a lot of money in a vacuum, but when you compare it to the fact that, okay, it's 3.8, it's money, but then there's also like manpower and resources that we don't spend in Israel, but we spend in all these other places. You have to account for those variables in order to come up with some sort of like net positive, right? Some sort of net positive benefit that you get out of it.
Would you agree with him that we shouldn't be sending?
I think that yes, but that can't happen overnight, right? I mean, I think there needs to be a gradual decoupling, because in order for that to happen, Israel needs to be able to manufacture all of its defensive weaponry and everything on its own soil. That takes time, right? I mean, if America was just like, oop, no, sorry, you're not getting anything. I mean, Israel could technically still win the war against Hamas, but they're not going to be prepared for a war against Hezbollah, for Iran. I mean, that would be existentially absolutely terrifying, because Israel cannot fight a multi-front war like that.
Right.
So right now, unfortunately, all of these weapons and everything are manufactured on American soil, and Israel needs them. I just want to make one other point about that. It is actually, this is not Ukraine. This is no stalemate. This war would have been over months ago, if not for the Biden administration. The Biden administration and Egypt have been prolonging this war. Why? Because a few reasons. And this is how you kind of know that Brianna is an anti-Semite, because she's so obsessed with Israel. She's so maniacally obsessed with blaming Israel for every single thing that she disregards very important actors in this situation, such as Egypt. You just won't hear her bring up Egypt, who, in my opinion, has been just as big of a factor in the way that this war has developed. But anyway, the reason why this...
Wait, how so with Egypt?
Well, well, I'll tell you for one. Biden has basically prolonged this war because Biden has said to Israel, you are not allowed to fight this war in the old-fashioned way with artillery because you're going to kill too many civilians. So we're going to send you all of these smart, precision guided weaponry, right? Like JDAM kits and everything, these incredibly expensive missiles that we want you to use so that you can minimize civilian casualties. So, okay, but that's going to prolong the war. Okay, so which way does Jake want it? Does Jake want the war over and Biden can stop sending any support, any help, and Israel can do this old-fashioned way, and that's completely legal, but there's going to be a lot more casualties? Or does he want this war extended and Israel to continue to set like the world record in civilian to combatant ratios and kill fewer civilians, per capita, per combatant than like any other army in modern urban warfare? I mean, which is it?
Right. Let's go to this next
clip. Did you want to talk about starvation?
No.
Okay.
That's not. It's complicated enough. It's so complicated, and then there's a long history of it. And I think what Constantine was trying to do was say, hey, look, and not a lot of Palestinians want to do this, but hey, October 7th happened, and now this war is happening. Is it just or not? Mm-hmm. Right? There are Palestinians that want to go back further and further and further, and what you're saying is that you can keep going back
even further than 1948.
Right.
Sure.
So it's I compare it to like, a bad relationship where you can keep going back further and further and just keep coming up with, or you just like cut it off and be like, all right, this is a bad relationship. We just need to move on.
Exactly. Oh, but you asked about Egypt. You said, how is Egypt a factor? Yeah, yes. Really quickly. So if you look at any other war, even ones going on now, like Ukraine, or look at like the Syrian civil war, wars produce refugees. People flee, right? 500,000 refugees, I think, or no, I think actually millions. There was 500,000 casualties in the Syrian civilian war, and millions of refugees were produced. And then Ukrainian refugees, I don't know the number, probably hundreds of thousands, right? How come this war has not produced refugees? Do you know why?
I don't know, no.
Because of Egypt.
Egypt's not taking these.
Egypt won't let anybody leave. How diabolical is that? That is actually, talk about war crimes and the ICC and international law. It is illegal to not, if you share a border, to not accept some number. Not only do they not accept Palestinians, they have like these fortified, like 3 layers of walls with dozens of tanks and guns pointed at the Palestinians at all times. And they shoot anybody who tries to leave. And there's also all these black market deals with the military where the more wealthy Palestinians now can pay. A few have managed to get out because they bribe the border patrol and they let them in. Now, Egypt is the second largest recipient of American aid after Israel. I think they get $3 billion or something like that. So if Bree and Jake care so much about where our money is going and how that is harming Palestinians, shouldn't they be really pissed that all that American money is going to Egypt, and Egypt is not doing the one thing that would guarantee a reduction in casualties, right? They think Israel is irredeemable. It's evil. It's sinful. There's nothing that will make Israel fundamentally good because it's corrupt. You heard Jake just say Israelis, there's terrorists in the government and murderers. So if they really care about Palestinians, Egypt is the only chance, it's the only hope for Palestinians to get out. But you don't hear them say one word about Egypt.
The refugees to go, because they share a border with Egypt, and Egypt's just not allowing it to happen.
Not allowing. Okay. And Biden could put pressure on Egypt. Biden could say, hey, you need to let some of these guys in.
Right.
Not saying a word.
So I think with what we were talking about with Constantine, what he was trying to bring it back to is like, look, you guys, the past is the past, and we cannot correct the past. Here's October 7th had happened, and now this is a direct effect of that. Cause and effect. What do we do about it? What's the solution? He kept coming back to it. He kept asking Jake and Brianna, like, what's your solution?
How did you find the way that Brianna answered questions?
Again, you and I were there that night. I sat next to your colleague Jan, and
my boss.
I'm sorry, your boss, your boss. And
I don't want to offend him.
I kept coming back to answer your question. She wasn't answering the questions, and I showed this to my wife, and I was like, she kept saying, or I kept saying, she's not answering the question. And
did your wife agree?
I'm not going to get into what she said about this. Okay. When you're in court and a judge is asking you a question, and that's effectively what Constantine was trying to be. The moderator is kind of calling balls and strikes. He's trying to be an umpire, trying to like moderate. And he was doing his best to try to elicit answers. And again, if you're in court and a judge is asking you a question and you're not answering the question, the judge is going to ask it again and if you don't, the judge is going to get the judge is not going to be very kind to you.
We've all seen those types of that litigation, how that goes. Yeah.
And
with the witness stands and everything.
I don't know. So Brianna's an attorney. She went to Harvard Law School.
Right.
She said in her bio, she was at a commercial litigation firm. I don't know how long. I tried to look up her bio. I saw her on Wikipedia. I don't know how long she was at the firm for, so I don't know how much litigation experience she has. I can't speak to it. But in this particular setting, her not answering questions directly is a red flag to me that says that she probably does not have the requisite litigation experience because she was not answering questions directly. So
yeah, I mean, she felt like Constantine was very biased against her because he kept, kind of interrupting her. But, what I saw is that unlike Jake and unlike Michael and
Jake was answering the questions.
Right. And unlike Eli and they did also do some interrupting, and that was not cool. It wasn't cool when Eli did it or when Jake did it. Okay.
They were getting testy and interrupting.
Yeah. And absolutely. Constantine called them out on it. But Brianna was so disrespectful of all of the other participants because she was sucking up their time. This is an hour-long debate.
Right.
And she was going on and on and on. And then Constantine would say, but what should happen? And then finally she would get to the right of return. That could have been the first thing that she said. And then she could have explained what that means.
So if I could speak to her her answers were, she was trying to make her talking points heard without being asked about her talking points.
Right.
That's what I got from the conversation that night.
Yeah, I think to me the split was,
which is selfish, I think.
Yeah, well, on the pro-Israel, for lack of a better term, side, to me you had analysis, and on the anti-Israel side you had narrative.
Not just versus just, right? So not just war side, narrative.
Not just war side,
narrative. Just war side. Now you got
analysis of the questions.
Yep. Eli was throwing some narrative in there
as opposed to a narrative that could disregard questions, that could rewrite history, that could create history in order to create the impression of the narrative that they were trying to
Credit to Constantine, he kept coming back to, what do we do about this now? What's your solution to the problem?
I think Constantine was great. I don't think he was unfair to Brie at all. In fact, I think he gave her a lot of rope, given how much time she was taking from other participants.
I talked to Constantine afterwards, and he was like, mate, was I being fair? I'm like, absolutely, you were being fair. I think you're probably being a little bit more generous than you maybe needed to be, because she was not answering questions. And if she did, she took a long time to get there.
Because again, she fundamentally rejected the premise. She didn't believe that it was a war to begin with. I don't know what you would call two sides fighting, if not a war, but she didn't even call it that. So she wasn't playing by the rules to
Right.
begin with.
Right. And I think you and I
She
talked
didn't
about
come in
this.
in good faith.
And this particular format, again, if you're litigating a case, there's motions in limine, before you even get to trial, there are pretrial issues that you need to work through. And it sounded
Right.
like they did not get to do that in this, which would make it very difficult for Constantine.
But Andrew, that's the problem that I have with pro versus anti-Israel debates in general. I told you this on the phone, but I think it's important that we clarify this point for the audience, which is that people who come in who do not believe that Israel has a right to exist. Like, it's one thing if they believe that the West Bank is occupied, right? That Israel should get out of the West Bank. If they hate Netanyahu, if they think the regime is the Israeli regime has to go,
and
whatever.
People say the West Bank is what, an open air prison or something.
Gaza, yeah.
I'm sorry,
whatever.
Gaza,
or
Gaza.
They disagree with how this war is being prosecuted. Those are all, points that we can respectfully disagree on. But if you come from the position of Jake or Bree, which is that Israel does not have a right to exist as a Jewish state, right? Then there's really no common ground from which to diverge. You have to agree, like two people have to agree the sky is blue when you're coming into a debate. There has to be they have to start on the same level and then diverge.
Like yep. Yeah, no.
But this is why, and the problem with, then the problem that this leads to the other problem with these types of debates is what you're essentially doing is you're putting on the same level people who believe that Israel has a right to exist, just like any other fully functioning state with millions of people in it in the world, with people who are actually genocidal, people who have eliminationist, annihilationist agendas for a fully functioning, breathing country with millions of people in it to be replaced with another entity.
And Michael was trying to make that point. You and I we'll get into that. Let's watch this clip and we'll comment on it.
We agree,
right? But here's an important point. Part of why the Hamas health ministry is very good at tracking the deaths is because, and by the way, Israel isn't contesting, apart from for political reasons, took a while for them to start contesting these numbers. It's because Israel knows where every single person in Gaza lives. Gaza is under the control of Israel. It is an occupied territory according to international law. And as a consequence, they know the names and ages and addresses.
Okay.
Okay, so she's saying Gaza is occupied under international law.
And they're really good at keeping the numbers because that Israel knows where everyone is.
I have no idea what she's saying. Like, is the point she's making because... Let's say that was true. I don't think that's not true. Israel's not occupying, but let's say that was true. If Israel knew where everybody lived, how would that translate to then Hamas knowing where everybody lives? They don't share information. They're mortal enemies. Do you understand how that would translate? Like that I just don't get it. Maybe I'm missing something here.
Yeah, I don't know where she's trying to go with this.
I can't really speak to that. Maybe she misspoke. But when it comes to Gaza being occupied by international law, it's first of all, you can only occupy sovereign nations. That's what the definition of occupation is. Okay, Gaza is not a sovereign nation, so it's not subject to military occupation. First of all, second of all, the reason why she's saying international law is because the United Nations General Assembly still considers it occupied. This proves to me that Bree doesn't understand what international law is. International law is not United Nations General Assembly resolutions. Those are non-binding resolutions. International law are things like the Geneva Conventions, right? Or other parts of or the UN Security Council resolutions. Okay, so that's not so Israel is not occupying Gaza according to international law by virtue of what I just said, that you can't even occupy, non-sovereign entities
because it's within Israel itself.
Well, no, it's a disputed territory, but it's not a sovereign nation.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if Israel was in there, it wouldn't constitute an occupation, though. That's what you would hear the international community screaming about. Okay. And then the one other thing to say there is, you can say that. okay, like there's a blockade of Gaza. You can say that, right?
Mhm.
People said there was a blockade before the war. There was a siege of Gaza.
Mhm.
That's something we can talk about, okay?
Okay.
And I would agree with that. Israel limited the types of materials that could cross the border into Gaza. But in occupation, Israel doesn't regulate them. Israel doesn't tax them. Yes, there's some amount of electricity and water that Israel controls, but the most important point to make here is that Israel doesn't have a single, we're talking about before the war, Israel didn't have a single soldier inside Gaza. What kind of occupation is that? What kind of occupation has nobody occupying the region? And if Gaza was occupied, you really think, I mean, what a lousy occupation to allow 300 miles of tunnels to be built and tens of thousands of rocket attacks since 2007 to be coming over the border and killing and injuring and traumatizing your civilians in the southern envelope? You really think that Israel would put up with that? Of course not. You don't see that happening in the West Bank because Israel is still in certain parts of that. That's just nonsense.
Okay.
Of all the people that have been killed. That is why Palestinians have been able to put up slideshows where you can scroll through. It takes about, I think, 7 minutes to scroll through the names of just the 13,000 children that have been killed with their ages next to their names. These are real people. And so even if you think every adult, including all of the women, were Hamas and deserve to die, I think there's a really important question as to whether or not you think the 13,000 children who have been killed, some of whom we've watched been tracked down and killed by Israeli drone cameras, are the adequate consequences, collateral damage for this allegedly just war.
Okay.
So Brianna,
I don't want to get into the numbers thing again.
Yeah, let's not get into the numbers because that 13,000 number can be heavily disputed. And the only thing I would say,
She's saying children, right?
children, yeah. And the only thing I would say about this that I think is just kind of funny is she's saying we've seen drones track children, right? Is she talking about just very classic modern warfare where you're trying to locate combatants with rifles or, you know, wearing like suicide vests, and so you have drones that are literally tracking them, and then they communicate with their counterparts and say, okay, you know, we've got, you know, Abu Shitface over here, pardon my language, with a grenade, and now we got to go and we got to, you know, take him out. I mean, this is just how war works.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't really understand the problem with what she's saying, but if she's saying children, just one really, really quick point, children, according to the, I guess, just the protocol, the UN protocol, whatever it is, it's considered in Gaza kids under 18. Okay. And we know that Hamas recruits child soldiers and that many of its members and fighters, including those who participated in October 7th, are like 16, 17, 18 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So I just have to say they're still technically children, but it paints a little bit of a different picture, right? When you're talking about like a 17-year-old with like an AK versus like, you know, a 5-year-old like running around.
Right.
Jake's right that it's really important to answer the question of what Palestinians want, to answer the question of what Israel should do in the wake of October 7th. And I think pointing to the fact that, like half the population of Gaza today are...
So she's finally getting to, because Constantine kept asking it, what should they do? What should Israel do? What should Palestine do? Right? And she's finally getting to it.
Mm-hmm. The actual people are the descendants of the 700,000 who were purged, ethnically cleansed from the land that is now called Israel and the Nakba. So I'm sure many of you can imagine what you would do in that sort of a scenario. If when your grandparents were young and your parents were their children in their house, they had been chased out of wherever you live, at 13 Pine Drive or whatever, and you were forced to move a state over in a refugee camp. That's constructively what Gaza is. It's a refugee population of 2.3 million people. And you can look over there. You are close enough. You can Google Maps if you have Google.
And I'm going to put this to them. I'm going to put this question to them. But what should Israel have done?
That there's a family that's literally living in a house that you might still have keys to, tending olive groves that were your family's line of business if they haven't cut those all down. And so the people who have had that experience, as you can imagine if you were in their shoes, are never going to let up, wanting to have the right to return to their homes. This is not a kind of 2,000 years ago sort of a dream. This is in my lifetime.
Okay.
So there's two things there. First, she's getting into the original 1947 war.
And you, like you kept saying, you can go back and back and back.
We can talk about
You can
that.
keep going back.
And we can talk, but she's talking about these 700,000 Palestinian Arabs that were displaced during the war.
Yep.
Okay. So we can get into that if you want. I can. Okay. So the other thing then I can address is she's basically saying, so these people who have had this experience of being displaced, they're never going to let go of this dream of returning.
Yep.
And then she kind of says, like, it's not like a 2,000-year dream, referring to like Jews, like ancient Israel, right?
This was like a generation ago.
Right. Okay. So here's my question. Why not?
That's what Eli asks.
Because Eli was talking about Pakistan. He was listen, the Nakba, quote unquote, happened 1946, 1948. That was that was when Israel's war for independence happened in 1947. Okay, that was right after World War II. There was tens of millions of refugees created after World War II.
Right.
There's 12 million ethnic Germans that were kicked out of Europe. Right. There was, like Eli brings up, Pakistanis. There was 14 million Indians and Pakistani refugees created in that war around the same time in 1947. Okay, there was almost 1 million Jews from Arab lands around that time that were ethnically cleansed and forcibly dispossessed. Okay, do you see any of those people saying, "I want to return to these lands"? No, my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. They left and went to Canada. I'm not holding on to any dream of, they're dead now, but I mean, this dream, extends to, she says, Palestinian descendants. Well, I'm a descendant. I'm not holding on to any dream of returning to Germany.
Yeah. And if you keep going back to it, it's Constantine keeps asking the question, and this is, what her answer is.
Return to India?
In my lifetime, you purged me from my literal home where I have keys to, and now it's being occupied by someone who maybe immigrated from Europe, maybe immigrated from Brooklyn, and that injustice really hits home. On top of that, you've been denied the right to have any kind of state, a passport, an airport, a country, the kind of things that constitute a country, right? Joe Biden is now spending your tax dollars building a port in Israel, in Gaza rather, because Gaza isn't allowed to have those kinds of infrastructure, basic infrastructure projects on its own. So what absolutely needs to be done is for there to be a right of return for the people who were purged out of Israel.
So Brianna, just so I understand, you think that Israel's response to October 7th would have been to build Gaza an airport. Is that right?
Is that what you think I just said?
Well,
you
I'm
have
just
some
trying to
serious
understand. I asked
listening
you the
comprehension
question.
issues, Eli, if you think that that's what I just said.
Well, no, I'm trying to get it. You just gave a long,
I can slow it down for you and say it
eloquent
again if you're struggling
soliloquy.
to understand, Eli.
I'm
Would you
not
like me to say
struggling
it for you
understand
again?
anything, Brianna.
Okay.
I'm asking you. You were asked what Israel should have done, and you gave a long soliloquy about how Gaza doesn't have infrastructure.
As the moderator,
so I'm
I
asking,
do
is
agree
that
with
what you
this,
think
but
Israel should have done in response
You
to
haven't
October
answered my
7th?
question, which is fine.
The right of return. Do you not know what the right of return is?
In response,
I know all about the right of
Yeah.
return.
Hold on, let me do my job.
Yeah.
So, in response to October 7th, Israel should have instituted the right of
I
return.
mean, long before October 7th.
No, but
there's
after
gonna
October
be
7th.
There's going to be no peace until Palestinians have been granted the right of return. Yes, that's right.
We're talking about...
Okay. So that was a long, and it got testy there.
Mm-hmm.
And Eli was...
He shouldn't have cut her off.
He was straw manning her argument, saying, "Oh, your solution is to build them an airport."
Yeah. Right.
But her answer
Is the right of return.
Okay, so explain this.
Right. So
for people.
what the right of return, according to Brianna and Jake, which they both agree is the answer,
After October 7th happens, Israel should have just let the Palestinians...
What they say is a refugee population of 6 million Palestinians return, quote unquote, to Israel proper.
Mhm.
Not necessarily the West Bank or Gaza,
Mhm.
but Israel proper.
That's their argument.
Right. Now, Israel is about the size of New Jersey
Mhm.
and has about 9 million people
Already.
already. Think
Okay.
about that.
So it's another 6 million.
Think about 6 million coming into a country of 9 million people the size of New Jersey.
So it'd be effectively 15 million plus.
Do you think
people.
any country in the world would tolerate that? A flood of 6 million people? But here's the thing. The idea that there are 6 million Palestinian refugees is one of the biggest flat out lies about this entire conflict. This is where the term the Palestinian refugee hoax or the Palestinian refugee myth came from. That number exists because of a UN agency called the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA. Now, UNRWA was set up in 1949, 1 year after the War of Independence, to deal with the 400,000 to 700,000 Palestinian Arabs that were displaced from that war. It was supposed to be a temporary agency, just like other temporary UN agencies, like there was one in Korea to deal with Korean refugees. And the way that you deal with refugees of any war, it's the way that all other refugees were dealt with after World War II, is you resettle them. There's the 3 R's of refugee protocol, how you deal with them: resettlement, reintegration, repatriation. The worst thing you want to do with refugees is keep them in camps, stateless, in limbo, dependent on social services, right, and welfare or whatever.
It's in a state of limbo. You want to resettle them,
of course, into new host countries.
So give me the 3 R's again. And are all these ors?
No, this is the process: resettlement, reintegration, repatriation. So eventually they're citizens. Okay. So that's why these tens of millions of refugees that were created after World War II don't exist today.
Why?
Because the numbers have gone down because they've been resettled into new countries, into new host countries, and now they have citizenship. My grandparents got citizenship in Canada. A lot of the Jews that fled got citizenship in Israel, right?
And they become patriots of that particular country.
Exactly. Okay. So here's the problem. UNRWA was created as in Article 22 of the United Nations, which means it's dependent on donations, okay? And the Arab world, which was engaging in a existential war against Israel at that time, basically said to UNRWA, look, we will continue to fund you, and you can stay in business as long as you do not resettle these refugees.
Okay.
As long as you keep them there. Right? So that we have some sort of leverage in our war against Israel. So the mandate of UNRWA since 1950, 1 year after it was created, is not resettlement. It is relief, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. All they do is provide them with education, healthcare, social services, with no mission to resettle them into new countries, as in contrast to the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee. This is the UN agency that deals with all the other refugees in the entire world. Isn't that weird that the Palestinians are the only group that get their own UN agency?
Okay, so let me back this up so I'm understanding you correctly.
But I haven't gotten to the point of why there's not 6 million refugees.
I just need to understand what you're saying. That, so UNRWA, what does that stand for? United
Nations Relief and Works Agency.
Okay, UNRWA is for these Palestinian refugees that were displaced after World War II?
No. Well, after World War II in the Arab-Israeli War,
right,
for Israel's independence. Yeah.
Okay. So, how many total refugees were there from that?
Anywhere from 400 to 700,000.
400 to 700,000 refugees that were. So they were saying 700,000, right?
Yeah, I think that's what they were saying. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. But notice that they're saying 6 million now.
Yeah. So
how does that happen?
Reconcile the numbers. I don't understand.
Exactly. So that's why I set this up so that you can understand that as time goes on, as in the case with other refugees, the numbers go down because they get resettled. Okay. So how can a population balloon from 700,000 to 6 million? It's because UNRWA, unlike the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which deals with all the other 50 million refugees in the world spread out across 130 countries, uses a different definition for what constitutes a refugee.
Right.
Okay. Yep. The UNHCR stops allowing refugee status when you become a citizen of a new country.
Right.
As it should be.
Makes sense.
Why would you still be a refugee if you're now a citizen somewhere else?
Yep.
Not according to UNRWA. So that means for example.
I see what you're saying.
So, for example, look at Jordan, okay? 70% of Jordan is Palestinian. By the way, Jordan was also historic Palestine. So when she's talking about the right of return and she's including all of these Palestinians in Jordan, why would they need to return to Israel? Jordan is also historic Palestine.
Okay.
So anyway, but so these 70% of 70% of the Jordanian population is Palestinian Arabs, and they have citizenship, and yet they are still considered refugees according to UNRWA.
Okay.
UNRWA extends refugee status to the descendants of refugees, even if they are citizens
Of a different country.
So this allows the Palestinian refugee problem to exist in perpetuity. In my opinion, it's the number one reason why the conflict still exists. The actual number of Palestinian refugees from this war is anywhere from 20 to 200,000. There was a classified document under the Obama administration that leaked under the Trump administration, or that was declassified under the Trump administration, that acknowledged that that showed that the U.S. government knew about the true number of refugees, and they said it was less than 200,000. Some people have said it's as little as 20,000. And Israel, in negotiations, and actually this is a point that Jake makes, has said, look, if you want to deal with the actual number of Palestinians, we will let those people return.
Yeah, we'll help you deal with that issue.
And then the last thing I'll say about the right of return. These refugees, as Brianna and Jake would admit, most of them are in the West Bank and Gaza. Where would they return to? This is their home. This would be their home in any future Palestinian state.
So they would return to the West Bank or Gaza.
Where they live now.
Where they live now.
Like, how do you return to your actual home? Like, they're in their home. They're in what would be a future Palestinian state. So she wants to kick all these people out of the West Bank and Gaza and put them into Israel? I mean, it's absolutely insane.
Okay.
But one thing is for certain. The right of return means no more Israel. You cannot have a demographic of 6 million Arabs come into a Jewish majority state and still have a Jewish state, because Jews would no longer be the majority.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, after the conflict in, was it 47 or 48?
Well, the war, the partition was 48. Israel declared its independence the partition was in 47. Israel declared its independence in 48. 1 day later, 8 Arab armies invaded and started the war.
Okay. And then this created, so Israel declares statehood, and this creates
a war.
But then from the war, there's roughly 700,000
exactly Palestinian Arabs,
Palestinian refugees after that, and then a lot of them got repopulated or got brought into other countries like Jordan,
Syria, Lebanon.
So they've been sort of resettled, as you said, and they become citizens of these countries.
Only Jordan. Syria and Lebanon will not give the Palestinian Arabs citizenship. It's terrible.
Okay. So of the 700,000, some of them go to Jordan and get citizenship. But since the 700,000, there's this number now that's ballooned up to 6 million.
Yeah. Because of UNRWA.
Okay.
Because they extend the definition to descendants.
I told you that I wanted you to explain this issue to me.
But isn't that nuts?
It is. I'm trying to understand it because this is not my wheelhouse.
I mean, and the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, think about this. They have a staff of they deal with about 50 million refugees spread out over 130 countries all over the world. And they have a staff of about 18,000. UNRWA deals with ostensibly 6 million refugees and has a staff of 30,000.
Okay, let's move on from that. So I told you that I wanted you to explain this to me as if I was a 5-year-old, and you're doing a very good job.
Oh, am I? I thought you were going to say you're doing such a bad job.
It gets very complicated. I'm trying to follow along and understand, and I want to get to these other clips.
Sure.
Because Constantine asked the question, both to Eli and to Michael, and here's what their responses were.
The Arabs did not
the
attack
antecedents-
Israel in 1967. Israel
What?
started that. Israel started the 1967
Oh,
war.
it
That's
did?
a false statement.
Do you want me to address that?
Yeah, what is Jake
So Jake's saying that Israel didn't start the 1967 war.
Wait, no, he's saying that Israel
That Israel did start it.
yeah.
Excuse me.
Mhm.
Pardon me. You know,
And then Eli interrupts and says,
really, have you ever
So
heard
there's
of
a
Gamal Nasser,
There's
the head of Egypt? at the
material
time?
dispute of fact here.
Right. And
Okay.
that is the one war where there's dispute over it.
Over
Who started it.
Okay, so
Because
this is-
technically, Israel launched a preemptive strike.
Okay.
However, as Eli says, Egyptians had been amassing troops at the border, saying that they were going to invade. And here's where Jake is just flat out wrong about this. Once Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran, that was internationally recognized as it's called a casus belli, an act of war.
Okay.
That was the first event in this war.
Okay. So I don't want to get into the history of this, but there is a dispute as to who started it.
Well, I mean, yeah, but I mean, Jake is talking about militarily.
Right.
Israel launched the first strike.
Yes.
Right? But that's not how the beginning or an end
Sure.
of the war is always measured.
Let's go to them trying to sort this out.
Listen,
I'm aware
this
who
is-
Gamal Abdel Nasser is. I'm aware he was building up troops on the border. I'm also
Do you aware that, like, every other day he was saying, "I'm gonna destroy Israel"?
I'm also aware he didn't start it. Israel started it.
Okay.
And U.S. intelligence's
All right, sorry.
assessment was
two
that
Arab armies are
US
amassed on Israel's
intelligence's
border,
assessment
and their
was
leaders
that
are yelling and
Egypt was
screaming about how
not
they're
going
gonna
to start the
destroy the
war.
Jews and
They
run all the
passed
Jews
this
into the sea.
information
Jake,
on
yeah,
to
okay,
Israel.
all right,
Let
go
the
for it,
man
Jake.
finish. And they invaded.
Yeah, we should have kept that in there because Michael got pretty irritated there, as he should be, because there was a lot of interrupting going on.
For sure.
And do you remember what Michael said after this?
What did he say?
I think he swore.
Yeah. Yeah, but see, the thing is that Brianna set the tone. Like, everybody was prepared to have like a very respectful debate, but as soon as you set the precedent of not really letting anybody get in there, then people are kind of forced to interrupt you to get a word in, and then it's just chaos.
There was a lot going on. It was pretty electric, actually. Okay, so because again, it gets a little bit heated, not as much as that one though, because in the earlier one where Eli said, "What your solution is to build an airport,"
Right.
And then Brianna got pretty ticked off,
Right.
And then they started getting after each other.
And it was kind of funny because, like you said, he was strawmanning her, but there was a strategy to it. The reason there always is it was to basically get her to zoom out and recognize that she wasn't answering the question.
But she got offended by it.
Of course, because she was like, "No, that's not what I said."
Yeah.
And it's like, well, we know, but you're not answering the question.
It was a jab. He threw. I mean, you could classify it as a right hook or a jab. He thought it was.
Uppercut.
Giving her a jab, and she took it as an uppercut, and she took offense to it, and then they started insulting each other, which you never want. You don't want sort of.
But tends to happen in these Israel debates.
It does because it's heated.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's watch this one now.
Did you want to say something before I go to Michael?
The irony is that that's almost the opposite of what's true. It's been widely reported.
Is it almost the opposite of what's true?
Let her say.
Wait a minute, Eli.
Patient
There was a
with
lot
them.
of screaming and hollering about interruption, so I just want to know what the standards are before I continue.
Guys, let me do the moderating and you do the debating, okay? So say your piece.
Bibi Netanyahu was caught delivering suitcases of cash to Hamas. He's so invested in funding Hamas and Hamas being in power in Gaza. And the reason is, Israel needs to be able to rely on the argument that the political power that Palestinians have is so radical, is so right-wing, is so hateful that there cannot be no negotiation. So he has worked to undermine the Palestinian Authority. He worked to undermine more moderate politicians that Palestinians have nominated over the years, have put forward over the years. And as early as this past week, as the International Criminal Court has looked into issuing warrants for Israelis who have committed war crimes, what has been his response? His response has been to threaten not Hamas or anything going on in Gaza, but to threaten to do more war crimes in the West Bank if he or any other members of his administration are charged with any of these ICC warrants. There has been a repeated effort to punish the most moderate Palestinians, because otherwise he would be forced to make a case for why he doesn't think that people who are literally from what is now described as Israel cannot return home. And the real reason why they cannot allow people to have the right to return is because there's a commitment to it being not just a pluralistic state like the one we live in, where we're very proud of having people from all over the world who found freedom from religious persecution, and you can live however you want to live and practice whatever religion you want to practice, that they specifically want it to be a Jewish ethno-state. And if you were to allow the approximately 5 million or so Palestinians that live in the West Bank and in Gaza to be a part of contiguous Israel, they would lose a religious majority and lose the ability to you could have a pluralistic, progressive state, but it would no longer be a Jewish ethno-state.
Okay.
A couple things. First of all, Israel is more diverse and pluralistic than any other country in the Middle East. Literally, what she's saying could not apply more to Israel. People come from all over the world, many fleeing persecution, not just Jews all over the world, but Christians, which I'll get into later when she makes a point about Christians. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I'll just say, because there was a lot there as well.
Karys, you can back up. You don't. The mic. It's definitely picking up.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
I would like to go back
Yeah,
up. I feel like I'm like slouching.
No, you're good.
I'm always trying to.
You're good.
The other thing is that this idea about Netanyahu handing suitcases of cash to Hamas
Yeah, explain that.
is a beautiful, just a beautiful fairy tale that she creates in her mind.
I'm not aware of this story. I don't know.
No, because it's completely false. He never handed suitcases of cash.
Can you explain what she's trying to?
All she's talking about, and this is publicly available. Like, there's nothing like secretive about this. He wasn't caught doing anything. Mm-hmm. This was an agreement that there was a lot of international pressure on Israel, because Gaza was a mess because Hamas was not governing it. And there was a lot of, reconstruction and help that they needed there and people suffering. And Qatar, who is like a negotiating partner in a lot of these situations, basically Israel agreed to allow Qatar to transfer funds to Hamas on the condition that it would be used for like A, B, C, and D, right? Like reconstruction and rebuilding, and there wouldn't be, and there would be like there wouldn't be hostilities from Hamas against Israel for X amount of time, right? It was a specific agreement.
What year was this?
And this, I don't know. You'd have to look it up. And this, because there's a lot of these types of agreements. Mm-hmm. Qatar has been funding Hamas to the tune of like hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, there's so much money that flows into there from Qatar and Iran, but Qatar, we think of as some sort of like good faith negotiator, which they're not. But anyway, the point is that this money was delivered by Israel from Qatar.
According to Brianna, Benjamin Netanyahu hand-delivered cash in duffel bags, suitcases.
You find me those pictures.
Why would she say something like that then?
Because, like I said, she's interested in a narrative. She's interested in creating history because she doesn't know history. Brianna, if me and you let's say I was the state of Israel and you were the state of Zimbabwe, you could murder me and Brianna would still find a way of blaming me. Everything that Israel does, even if it's like protocol or like something that other countries do, right, is to be demonized. And anything that anybody else does that's unethical or problematic or immoral is actually the fault of Israel to her. That's why I would say that Brie is anti-Semitic, because people did all this kind of stuff with the Jews. They still do today. Everything is the fault of the Jew, and for her, everything is the Zionist fault. They're all the conspiracy theories in the world. It all amounts to the Zionists. They're starting the wars. They're controlling the media. They're controlling the government. They, all of the classic medieval tropes that people used against Jews. If you go through Brianna's Twitter account, and every time she says the word Zionist, you just replace the word Jew, you're going to get a Twitter account that is indistinguishable from prominent neo-Nazis or anything that you would find in Mein Kampf or the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. She just has replaced the word Zionist with Jew, which she doesn't even realize is a very deliberate Cold War campaign of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union invented anti-Zionism. It's not some grassroots pro-Palestinian, campaign. But anyway, that's a whole other thing to get into.
Okay, so Michael finally gets in here into the game. He'd been waiting for a long time. We was not interrupting. So.
Oh wait, and can I just say one other thing? Sorry, I just have to say, her saying that Netanyahu wants to keep the Palestinians separated, right? I just have to say I don't really see anything wrong with being very happy when the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, two competing governing powers, are fighting and killing each other, because then that means that they're not killing Israelis. Mm-hmm. This is a very it's real politic. It's it's a very kind of understandable and self-interested policy that countries would pursue.
And she's saying that that's what Netanyahu wants.
And I don't see what's wrong with that.
You're saying that there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
Because politically speaking, if
they're fighting each other, they're not focused on their war against Israel.
Okay.
But how do they address the fact that they're living in conditions in which they don't want to be living?
It's the same answer. It's the same answer. I mean, look.
No, that's a negative. Don't start a war is a negative answer. How do they get a better deal for them without starting more wars?
How about I say don't start future wars? That's one thing that you could do. But if you think about this, there was a Palestinian guy I saw interviewed, and he said, before the Second Intifada, I could take my donkey from the West Bank to the sea. And as a result of militancy in the absolute people shouting about intifadas, when you go back and see 1,000 Israelis were killed, 1,200 Israelis were killed during the Second Intifada. And what do you do now? I mean, look, it's a very, very difficult question. If I had that answer, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be in Tel Aviv cashing checks because I knew the answer to this. But the answer is, in the broadest possible way, is that you have a people that are corrupted by a corrupt ideology. What we will never talk about here, and I don't hear this talked about in any of the conversations about the conflict now, is Islamism, is a radical Islamic view of the world, which is dangerous. And it's dangerous if it's not that it's anybody who has that sort of radical view of the world. And that is being inculcated in children, in the schools. I mean, we have these arguments with Ron DeSantis and the kids, the books kids are reading here. Look at what is being taught to kids in Gaza. That is a very difficult question, Constantine, and it's like a root and branch kind of thing. I didn't see a solution.
Okay,
I'm going to
so
move on.
Michael's solution when he was asked the question was the same as Eli's. Palestine should not start wars that they can't finish.
Mm-hmm. I think
and Constantine didn't like that answer. He's
right.
Like, what can they do moving forward?
Right.
And what Michael's answer was, okay, well then stop all future wars.
Right. I think Constantine should have specified, because he's saying, how do you address the conditions that they're living in? I think he should have specified whether he wanted Michael to address the socioeconomic conditions that they're living in, or the fact that they don't have a state. And those are two separate things to tackle, two completely different solutions.
What are
and the socioeconomic conditions are because Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are kleptocrats. I mean, they starve their populations. I mean, it's kind of funny. People think of Gaza, like you said, as this open air prison, but there's extreme luxury alongside poverty in Gaza. If you're actually in Gaza and you go to the nicer, the wealthier areas, there's enormous wealth.
Why is
And
that?
because that's how, because they're kleptocrats. That's how
What does that
Hamas
mean,
works.
kleptocrat?
Because they enrich themselves.
How do they do that?
Because all the aid that flows into this area and all of the taxes, right?
You're saying that a select few just take it.
Of course, the biggest cash income to Hamas comes from their taxing of the population, but they also get, there's also enormous aid that flows into their hands, right? And what do they do with this? They don't build institutions, they don't build schools, right? They don't build healthcare facilities. They spend it all, living their own luxurious lives with their, with their entourage, right? Or they invest it in tunnels and, in rocket launchers and fighting Israel. And I mean, I think also the point that Michael was making when he's saying don't start wars, it's like it didn't have to be this way, right? Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005, not just the troops, they literally evacuated every single Jewish citizen that was living there. You said
nobody's living in Gaza.
There's no Jews living in Gaza. In some cases, the army pulled the Jewish citizens out by their hands. They dragged them out of their homes. I mean, you can imagine if your own government came and pulled you out of your house and said you can't live here anymore because we want to try to make peace with our enemy. How abandoned would you feel? Like, oh, they care more about the Palestinians than me. I'm a citizen of Israel, right? But that's what they did. In the interest of peace, they pulled every last Jew out of Gaza in 2005, and there was no blockade for 2 years. And Hamas came to power in, a democratic election, but then a coup, because then they purged the strip of their rivals, of rivaling factions, and in a very bloody civil war, and they started launching attacks at Israel, and then Israel, was like, well, we got to control our border, and they along with Egypt blockaded the strip. Isn't it again funny that Jake and Brianna never mention Egypt, even though the blockade is much stricter with Egypt? Like Israel lets in way more materials than Egypt does. And I mean, so there's a cause and effect, and it's really hard with these types of conversations to try to figure out which is the cause and which is the effect, because both sides are saying this is the result of this, and the other side is saying, one side saying A is a result of B, and the other side is saying no, B is a result of A. It's a circular sort of. You're trying to figure it out. It's a dragon eating its tail, or a chicken or the egg sort of argument. Right. Okay. So,
how does this, at some point, please God, get resolved in one way or another? And the maximalist positions from both sides are quite obviously unattainable, certainly in my opinion. How do we find a way out of this rather than having a debate about what happened in 1967 and 1945? Because it doesn't. Can I just say something?
This is where Constantine's he's good. He's trying to bring it back to.
Yeah, well, he's trying to be neutral, but I don't know what how you could possibly characterize Israel's position as maximalist when they have offered up to 98% of the disputed territories in peace negotiations to the Palestinian Authority. Now, I mean, how is that maximalist? The maximalist position is Palestinians rejecting anything less than a full right of return of 6 million people. Israel's been prepared to negotiate. They've been prepared to share Jerusalem. They've been prepared to do population exchanges. Again, they've been prepared to give them 98% of the physical land that they wanted. Yeah, not necessarily contiguous, but they're open to negotiation. So I don't know how that could be a maximalist position. Now, what they are not going to do is, offer 98% of Israel proper.
Me, that takes the conversation forward. So, Jake, perhaps you
I
can start
actually
us.
disagree with that framing a little bit.
Okay, tell me why.
I do believe peace is possible, but I think it actually requires a discussion of the past, because I think there does have to be a reckoning with the past in Israeli society in order for us to be able to move forward. And I want to talk about the United States as an analogy. So, in this country, we did terrible things to the Native Americans. It was horrific. What we did in time was, after World War II, we gave billions of dollars in reparations to the Native Americans. We realized we were able to accept that we had done bad things, and we also gave Native Americans citizenship, okay, which they hadn't had for much of American history. That's the right way to deal with something like this. And
give that some shape. What does that solution look like?
it looks like a right of return. So you have to have at least a little bit of that. I mean,
Can I
if
say
you draw the
something?
border.
The Native Americans.
So he's creating an
And he said the way that we dealt with the Native Americans would have been the right way to deal with the Palestinians. That is so embarrassing.
Why?
Because yes, we gave them reparations,
Mhm.
but we robbed and destroyed their culture. We put them on reparations. This is such a Western-centric.
We put them
Sorry.
on
Sorry. We gave them reparations. We put them on reservations. We disconnected them from their past. The youth has no purpose. They've fallen into alcoholism and suicide. I mean, it's a horrific situation, regardless of the reparations. And if this is his model for how to treat the Palestinians, I mean, I think that says a lot more about Jake than it does about Israel or America.
So he's comparing Israel to the U.S. and then the Palestinians to Native Americans. If I want to try to give him his due, I think what he's saying is like the Israelis should give reparations to Palestinians, and same as like reservations, Native Americans have their own land.
But how would you determine which it's in the 1947-48 war, some Palestinians fled even before the war. Some ended up being expelled.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You would have to determine who is eligible.
It'd be very, very difficult to sort of.
And also, it wouldn't be enough for Jake and Bree, because remember, Jake and Bree are claiming that 6 million people deserve these reparations, not the anywhere from 20 to 200,000 now that are the actual original Palestinian Arabs that were displaced in the war.
Yeah, let's finish. Let's see what else he says here.
In the right way for a two-state solution, it's possible that won't necessarily destroy the Jewish character, but why is that something? I don't understand why Michael is so interested in protecting that exactly. Again,
well, I think his argument is if you have 7 million Palestinians return, then you're in a position where that's going to cause way more conflict and war, not less. That's his argument, I think.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
It's about right. Yeah.
I don't really think that's the case, and I think that's kind of ahistorical for the conflict. Listen, a lot has happened, so things are.
So what is he trying to say there? Because I believe Michael is sort of what you're saying is you bring these 6-7 million Palestinians back, it's going to cause more conflict than it's going to solve. And then, but what's Jake saying? He says, I don't really agree with that because of why? What is he trying to say here?
Well, he's saying, sorry, I'm reading the transcript here as I'm watching it, and just so I know specifically, and he's saying, well, it might destroy the Jewish character because you would have a majority now of Arabs and not Jews. But why? But he's basically saying, I don't understand why Michael's so interested in that. And there it is. There you go. That is like the whoa moment of this entire debate, because right there, Jake admitted, and he hadn't up until then, even though we had been talking about it, he admitted that for him, it's okay that there is no Jewish state.
That's because Michael.
That for him, peace means no Israel.
Yeah. Okay.
And I just, I just have to say that as one of the most persecuted peoples in history, the Jews, you know, expelled from 109 countries, having experienced pogroms and forced conversions and a Holocaust and inquisitions, you know, for him to be okay with one of the most persecuted people on earth not having a homeland shows how comfortable and spoiled he is as a Jew in America. That he has grown up not understanding his own history and how much Israel is such a vital part of the vast majority of Jewish lives, not as much as in America, but definitely everywhere else. And that is why poll after poll, you know, they take anywhere there's the Jewish population is very well recorded. Like you can look on Wikipedia and country by country see exactly how many Jews there are. And it's really funny. It's like, you know, it's like 6 million in Israel, you know, 6 million in the US, and then, you know, 2 million here, you know, whatever, Argentina, France. And then it like drops and it's like 40,000. And then it's like, you know, 18 and like 6. Like there's literally places where there's 6 Jews, right?
It's probably Thailand.
You know, what was I going to say? I was going to make the point that these diasporan Jews, when their countries do polls or when organizations take polls of them, it comes up again and again and again that Israel is an integral part of like the vast majority of their identities.
Yep.
So like anywhere from, and then they average those polls to get like a global number. And they've come up with a statistic that says anywhere from 88 to 95% of Jews are Zionists, meaning Israel is an important part of their identity. So when anybody says, I am just anti-Zionist and not anti-Jewish, they're essentially saying that they are anti the vast majority of Jews in the world.
Let's have him finish up
Different
here.
now, but the conflict was really started by Zionists coming to Palestine, not to live just in a society with all these Arabs, but with the intention of forming a Jewish state on top of their country. And the Arabs didn't really like that very much.
So your solution is to not have a Jewish state?
Listen,
Brianna, you're nodding,
well,
so we'll get to you.
Okay, listen, I think that is both ethical and workable. However, peace is what's most important to me, and I really want to stress that.
So how do we get there, right?
Yeah, and it's so I understand that, like, to get there, you'd have to convince the Israelis on the ground to want that. There has been hate that has developed amongst Palestinians over a century. Like, I certainly don't deny that. So there has to be changes in that society as well. It's a psychological shift, and that's why I say I do think we actually have to talk about the past and reckon with what happened with the past so that people on both sides can be able to say, wrong things happened here and we need to move on and change. And I actually do think that was sort of happening a little bit in Oslo. You know, you hear so much about how the tone shifted in that decade, but it wasn't enough, and it wasn't going to go far enough. And you know, ultimately, if there's some solution, listen, I don't know, this is literally the most complicated geopolitical conflict in the world. It's famous for that. And so any solution that can reach an agreement amongst these people and get them to stop fighting and get them to live in peace, I'm happy with that.
I hear you. That's why I'm asking the question. And by the way, I'm not expecting us to solve it here, although that'd be nice. But I do think we have an obligation to think about how this gets solved. So, Brianna, what would your solution look like?
Before we get to Brianna, because we know her, and I didn't know that's. I eventually at that night I was like, whoa, like Jake, that's your solution, which was shocking to me.
Really embarrassing.
Okay, and then so Brianna, I feel like Jake didn't want to say it explicitly, but Brianna was very willing to. She was nodding her head there, and we're gonna listen to what she has to say here. And you just explained why this is very problematic.
Yeah, look, I mean, if Hitler had managed to kill all the Jews, right? If he had managed to kill 2/3 of every single, he did manage to kill 2/3 of all Jews in Europe. Okay? If the Allies had never responded, there would probably be peace after that. Right? I mean, you could have just let Hitler take over everywhere he wanted, kill everybody he wanted to kill.
And that's the logic.
Then there would just be peace.
And that's the logic that you think Brianna and Jake
because,
are going down.
Yeah, I mean, if there was no Jews in Israel, there would probably be peace.
Okay, I get it.
I think the idea that there can't be a world where Jews and Muslims, Arabs and non-Arabs live together is belied by the reality of history. Prior to the founding of Israel, Arab Jews did live peacefully alongside Muslims in what is now described as Israel. And there was this quip about how there are no Jews living in the West, in Gaza. Why would there be? You had an establishment of a Jewish state that is the number one welfare beneficiary of the United States of America, receiving more American aid than any other country in the world, despite obviously being more affluent than most of the countries in the world. I think there's a relationship there. Currently, there is a minority, but a significant Christian population in Gaza. One of the oldest Christian churches in the world has been bombed by Israel in the course of all of this. Former Congressmember Justin Hamas has lost family members that have been killed by Israel in the context of this, and even that wasn't enough to shake American foreign policy.
How do we get to a solution?
So I think that we have to not talk about Arabs as though they're somehow constitutionally different than Danes. I don't know why we would essentialize populations in that way. We have to be open to the idea
Danes don't
that the
do
people.
October 7th?
Wait a minute. Muslims didn't do October 7th.
Not since the Vikings.
Gazans didn't do October 7th. And if you're adopting the worldview that everyone in Gaza, the 2.3 million people, are responsible, then you are very much in line with Netanyahu's right-wing government, who thinks that and therefore thinks it's appropriate to violate international law by doing collective punishment on the population, literally starving them to death, having them on the brink of famine, killing 13,000 kids. There was a very passionate description of the graphic reality of October 7th at the beginning of this talk. And I just want to take a moment to say that it's also true that we've seen video after video of Palestinian father picking up the pieces of his children and collecting them in a plastic bag. I totally agree. The question is why in Israel?
Brianna, let me give you
Israelis
let me
are
give you
rioting.
20 more seconds.
Are rioting.
20 more seconds if you want to talk about getting to a solution.
In Israel, protesters are protesting Netanyahu because of the news widely reported again this week that he rejected a deal to release all of the hostages on October 8th. There are people who have been living with no medical treatment, the American soldier that just had the proof of life without an arm, because Netanyahu has made the decision to want to persecute this war and get, okay, the answer is...
You're not answering my question.
I'll answer the question.
Go.
I'm sorry, I do feel like a lot of responses...
20 more seconds.
Okay.
20 more seconds. The solution, please, go.
The solution is there has to be, I think there was a world where they had a two-state solution. America just said again, it's not... demonstrated again that's not a part of our policy, as evidenced by the fact that we vetoed the recognition of Palestine as a state, which is a path toward getting a two-state solution just last week. So there has to be a one-state solution, which means that there cannot, when Hamas is talking about eliminating Israel, it's talking about not killing all of the Jews. It's about eliminating the idea.
Okay.
It's about...
Leave it there. We'll leave it there. Brianna, we'll leave it there.
It's about, let me just finish, sir. Can I just finish the sentence? It's about eliminating...
Okay, what did she say there?
She said that when Hamas talks about basically eliminating Israel, they're not talking about killing all of the Jews.
And Eli started laughing. You started laughing.
I mean, this is hilarious. It's like if somebody says, I want to kill you, are you going to then turn around and be like, this guy doesn't really, that's not really what he means. Like, I mean, you just listen to them, like listen to what Hamas says. Like they use the word Zionist and Jew and Israeli interchangeably. They're very clear about their goals.
Why is it they use
because
if
they only cared about, if they wanted a state and they just didn't, if they wanted a Palestinian state and they didn't want an Israeli state, then they would be very clear about, supporting a Jewish presence in the land that they would then be in control of. But they're not. I mean, in their original charter, they have a quote from the Quran, from chapter 7 of the Quran, that's like, something like, here is a Jew hiding behind a tree, like find him wherever, find the Jew wherever he is hiding and kill him. I mean, and people say, well, they updated their charter.
This is
no,
Hamas?
Hamas. they say, oh, they have a new charter. No. They never had a new charter. They had an add-on, like an addendum, something that was like an addition. It was never like the new draft. It was never like the new part of their charter replaced any sort of like old part. But I mean, if it's not true that they like want to destroy Jews, like how come Gazans who have managed to get out of that situation and are very critical of Hamas have said over and over again that they were raised under Hamas curriculum to hate Jews? Listen to all the Muslim reformers out there that grew up in these communities, and not just in Gaza, but all over the Middle East. Look at what they're learning. Look at the hate education.
This is common knowledge for Eli's Jewish, you're Jewish.
I mean, to say that Hamas doesn't hate Jews, I mean, that's like saying Hitler didn't hate Jews. I mean, it's as absurd. It's the same type of denial that people engaged in and continue to after the Holocaust.
You're talking about Nazi Germany. There was a denial that
the Holocaust existed, that this many Jews died,
and that the Nazis wanted to eliminate the Jews.
Yeah, or that the Jews collaborated with the Nazis. I don't know. But it's the same. I'm talking more about like the approach that it's the same type of like
mentality,
like mind manipulation. It's the same type of self-deception.
So let me get this straight.
And again, it's pushing a narrative.
And what
she's trying to fit the facts into her already established narrative,
into a theory that she has, and her theory
she's
is
caricaturing the conflict.
Let me see if I can understand if we can understand what her theory is. Her theory is that you bring the Palestinians back in, right of return, that they can all live together in peace and harmony. Is that what she's sort of thinking?
Well, yeah, because she says, again, she creates this. She doesn't even like rewrite history. She literally creates history when she says that before the state of Israel, Muslims and Jews lived peacefully.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
During the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah.
Where they like would go storm Jewish communal
but that's
prayer
her idea, right?
and destroy Jewish holy sites, and the massacres that took place throughout the 1920s.
I don't want to revisit. We've gone through the history of it, but that's sort of her idea. That's
it's
her
a
theory.
fantasy.
Yeah. Okay.
Jewish state. Getting a Jewish state, getting an ethno-national state, having a state more like what we have in the United States.
Yeah. I understand that. So have you heard this phrase, there is and ought to be?
Yeah.
There is, right? Which is the practical world.
The reality.
Reality, right? And then there ought to be, it means, the world should be like this.
Mm-hmm.
And she's living in ought to be land, but in reality, there is. I think Eli understands it. I think Michael understands it.
Right.
I think Jake is kind of on the fence where he kind of knows, but he doesn't want to explicitly say it. Whereas she's living in just a completely different.
There's
utopia. She wants utopia.
Right.
Okay.
Most leftists do. But there's a figure, Hajamin al-Husseini, who is an incredibly important figure from the early 1900s, like the 1910s on until the 40s when Israel was reestablished, that some argue was single-handedly responsible for radicalizing Palestinian Arab society and Nazifying it. And because he was appointed by the British during the British Mandate, he was appointed the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was the spiritual leader of the Arabs, okay, the religious spiritual leader of the Arabs in that region. And there is an infamous picture of him sitting down with Hitler during the war. He was an outspoken anti-Semite. I mean, his sermons against the Jews, Jews are filthy, they need to be killed, they're untrustworthy, everything. He allied with the Nazis during World War II. He went to Berlin. He lived there from 1941 to 1945. The Nazi regime paid him a very generous salary every single month. What he did in Germany was he would broadcast Hitler's messaging in Arabic to the Arab world on the radio. And he was also responsible for provoking many of the massacres against Jews there. But and most people don't know about him, but
What was his name again?
Hajamin al-Husseini. And one thing that nobody knows about him is that he purged that region of moderate Arabs. There were Arabs there that did want to coexist with the Jews, right? And they loved what was happening.
And he got rid of them.
He got rid of them. And they loved what was happening. They saw that the Jews had come, the refugees, right? Like, I wanted to say this before. Jake says this started with the Zionist project, with Zionists coming to the land, right? As if they're like crusaders with torches. These are refugees. These are Jewish refugees that had been fleeing persecution in Europe or in the Middle East, in Yemen, right? And in Russia. And
you're talking about that came back. There were refugees that came back.
Right, that came throughout the 1800s and the 1900s. And they came as refugees, as a persecuted people. They all came to this region because they knew this was their indigenous home. This is where they prayed to every year. Next year in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is mentioned 700 times in the Torah. It's not mentioned once in the Quran. This is their holiest site, right? And this is where they are from. And so this is where they trace their ancestors to the Levant. And so they came thinking this is the only place they can be safe. They traveled long, long journeys to get there. And they came and they started, and there was no country there, unlike what Jake says. They came and took their country. There was no country. It was controlled by the Ottomans, and then it was controlled by the British. There was no sovereign nation. There wasn't even nations back then. Until Sykes-Picot, when Sykes-Picot started, the agreement, and it split up all the countries around in the region. But these Zionists came and they were tilling the land, and they bought land from absentee landowners, and they were literally nation building with their hands. And a lot of the Arabs were like, wow, this is bringing us a lot of opportunity.
So there are a lot of moderate Arabs in that area. They're like, okay, like we can do this. But then this person, what was his name again?
Hajamin al-Husseini.
Al-Husseini.
Yeah, in the massacres of Jews.
What years is this?
He was appointed in 1920, I believe.
Okay.
All the way until after World War II.
Okay.
Yeah. And
what happened to him then?
I don't know what happened in his later days.
After World War II,
yeah,
he was friends with the Nazis?
Oh, yeah. He lived there from 1941 to 1945.
And after the war?
And then he came back. I think, he must have gone somewhere. Mm-hmm. So,
he was still alive.
Maybe it was, he was still alive. Maybe he went to Egypt, maybe Jordan, maybe Lebanon. We'd have to.
So what you're saying is his work in the Israel.
He was
region.
Such a substantial character, and he Nazified the region.
Yeah.
Really, he did. There's a reason why Mein Kampf and Protocols of the Elders of Zion are still like in displays in bookstores in the West Bank and Gaza and throughout the Arab world. This is a very, very highly anti-Semitic society. They glorify Hitler in their textbooks.
So this is the reason why, because it's so substantial, this sort of ideology in that region, that what Brianna is talking about, it's just an impossibility.
Everywhere.
She wants it to be like a melting pot.
Everywhere in the Arab Muslim world that Jews have lived, everywhere throughout history.
Yeah.
They have lived as dhimmis, as second-class citizens. There have been massacres, and there has been mass persecution and discrimination.
Got it.
And expulsions. What makes Brianna think that this would be different?
Okay, we got one more clip to play, and we'll try to get you out of here.
So, a couple of minutes on what the solution is. How does this get solved? I know you said earlier that it's tough and you'd be making lots more money than you are.
You think that I'm going to come up with it in that short period of time?
Well, I would like to hear from all of you a step towards the solution. I think that's a reasonable ask.
A step towards the solution is the destruction of Hamas and the return of the hostages.
How do you do that?
That's a start.
Okay.
How do you destroy Hamas?
It's happening now. It's happening now.
It's not.
We had a conversation. If we believe Hamas's own numbers, that 6,000 of their fighters have been killed,
so
that's a start.
You're
Okay,
comfortable.
Brian, sorry, you've had your time. Go for it.
Well, I just want to say something. In a rare point of agreement with.
Can I address one thing there?
Yeah.
He says, you take out Hamas, and she says, how do you do that? And he says, it's already happening. And she says, it's not. I'm just curious what she would say about the fact that all but 4 of Hamas's battalions have been taken out. They're on their last stronghold in Rafah. The core command infrastructure is completely gone. They have raised infrastructure in Gaza City and Khan Yunis and now in Rafah. They have been managed to, shut down a lot of their corridors that had supply routes. I'm not sure in what world she's living in. I mean, maybe she thinks that, they say that you can't actually kill an ideology, right? Like you can
Maybe that's what she's
right. But the thing is
about.
you don't need to, right? I mean, you didn't kill the Nazi ideology in World War II. There was still plenty of Nazis existing.
But you took out the troops.
Well, exactly. You took away their governing power, and you took away their ability to be a substantial military fighting force.
And
that is realizable, and that is
Michael's talking
happening.
about.
Yeah, and just look at the doctrine of war. You only, in order to be defeated in war, 50 to 70% of your capabilities, military capabilities, have to be destroyed. So they don't need to destroy all of Hamas. They need to get the big guys. They know what they're doing, and it's happening now, as
Michael's saying.
We should think about a world where Arabs and Muslims and Jews can live together in a peaceful civil society, but fortunately that place exists. It's called Israel. Now, my solution is very similar to Michael's. There are times in history when a particular group suffers such a massive military defeat that it creates ripples of discrediting of this kind of approach. And there needs to be a kind of reckoning for Palestinians to give up on their 100-year delusion that their freedom and that their sovereignty depends on the elimination of Israel. And I know that you are coming, Brianna, from a very good place where you say, well, everybody should live in peace in one state from the river to the sea. But in fact, what you're doing is you're feeding the delusion that's only going to get more Palestinians killed. What Friends of Palestinians should say is very simply, this is never going to happen. You're not going to eliminate Israel, except half a loaf. And Israel changes on a dime. They have elections, it seems, every 3 months. So the point is, and by the way, the last government before this one had for the first time an Arab party in the ruling coalition. There are Arab Supreme Court justices. So if there was a viable Palestinian leader that said, all right, let's do it, let's negotiate a deal, I am sure the Israelis would say, great, because they just want to get on with their lives like, so many other people in the world.
He's in prison.
How likely is that viable Palestinian leader to emerge in the circumstances that we're in now?
Well, it can only emerge after everybody who believes that Hamas has, all of this momentum, sadly, bolstered by these moronic college students and professors.
Hamas is literally bolstered by Benjamin Netanyahu.
What? Say it again?
You're blaming college students for bolstering Hamas when we know that Bibi Netanyahu, as quoted to you directly just now, is the one that's bolstering him.
You factually misrepresented Netanyahu.
Solution.
College kids have more power than the man literally funding Hamas.
For the physical destruction, the utter discrediting, the total rethink, so that every single Palestinian who thought that maybe Hamas had the way to their dream palace of a Palestine from the river to the sea, and that they were like, we were being lied to, they've brought us nothing but misery. And then at that point, maybe there's a moment to say, all right, let's negotiate. You can't always get what you want.
All right.
Okay. So a lot there, but basically,
I think he said it well.
Eli.
I have nothing to say. Just kidding. No, I think he did a really good job.
Because there's just two fundamental differences. And I think you hit it on the head. There is the one side where you think that Israel cannot exist, and then the other side where it has to exist.
I mean, what other country do we sit around talking about like this, right? Like we'll talk about the Iranian regime or the CCP or, the North Korean regime, but do we ever sit around being like, China doesn't have a right to exist. Iran doesn't have a right to exist. Like Israel is held to this impossible standard, even though there are 200 land disputes in the world. Israel's not the only land that is disputed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There is dozens upon dozens of lands, Western Sahara and Northern Cyprus and Catalonia and Corsica, I mean, all over the world, where people are saying, we want to be independent, and another side is saying, no, you're part of us, or whatever. This just goes on all over the world. This is a fact of life. And yet Israel is held to this standard, and it's the only place where we actually think it's legitimate to have an argument about whether it should be replaced with another sovereign entity. Okay, and regardless of whether Jake and Bree believe that all the Jews can stay there within this next entity, it still wouldn't be Israel, because Israel is a Jewish state. You would have to rename it something else or whatever. That's just, Israel is the land of the Jews. It's the Bible. That's, yeah, and I think that one thing that I find really interesting in this whole debate is that the developments in the war have not affected any of the data or the facts that Bree or Jake presents, even though things that were happening at the beginning of the war in November and in January and even in March are very different than what is happening now. And there's been a lot of changes, and there's been a lot of developments, and a lot of the numbers have shifted, and things were happening before that are no longer happening, right? There was people, you didn't have a lot of food at the beginning. Now there's a surplus of food. I mean, things have changed. And yet for them, they have one narrative, 70% women and children, mass starvation, whatever. And they don't let how the war is playing out affect these facts, even if Hamas themselves are altering the numbers. And there's a lot of stuff we didn't get into. We didn't get into the starvation claim. We didn't get into the history of anti-Zionism and how it's a Soviet Union campaign, and how Jake and Bree don't realize that they're victims of just like Soviet propaganda. Mm-hmm. But it's I think that there's just a lot of interesting observations about Jake and Bree's position that I think say more about them than it does about their positions.
Well, if you look at the audience, the polling, it was overwhelmingly on the side of Eli and Michael at the end of the night.
Well, to begin with, too.
To begin with, yeah, but more numbers moved towards their position at the end there.
Yeah, I think it was like 70% of people believed it was a just war at the beginning, and then I think it
shot up
increased
to
I thought it only shot up to like 78 or 74.
Maybe, I don't know.
But that's still, even 4%, that's like what, like 6 people or something? I mean, that's a lot to have somebody change from this is not a just war to a just war. So even if, Bree and Jake want to say, oh, well, it was, we were not given a chance from the start because the audience was overwhelmingly not in favor of us, there was still, a handful of people who were on their side who went to the other side. Now, maybe there was a couple people that went from it being a just war to not a just war. But I think when I looked at the numbers, it was, we'd have to look at that poll again to see what it is. But
it was overwhelming to Eli and Michael's side. But we will. This topic, obviously, there's a whole lot more to it, and there's a couple other videos that I wanted to dissect with you, but not here. But thank you for coming on, Karys, Rhea, Epoch Times. Thank you for coming on the Politics Pagoda.
Thank you for having me. This has been really fun.
Awesome. Thank you.